Welcome back to the Historical Movies Podcast. In this episode, The Man Who Won the War. It's Michael Collins. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined as ever by a Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter, Bryce Evans. Bryce, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Good. And in today's episode, Michael Collins, directed by Neil Jordan, a budget of $25 million, took $32.8 million at the box office. IMDb score of 7.1, which I think is a bit low because, for reasons which we'll cover on this podcast, Bryce, as we go through, I think this may be the best collaboration, the best balance between Hollywood and history that we've seen for a very long time. So we're going to talk about what we love about this movie. I think we're both big fans of this movie. Then we're going to get on to the history. And Bryce has written extensively about this subject, so you're extra qualified to talk about it. And then, listeners, in the final third of the podcast, we have a list of questions that we ask of every movie. Favourite film, favourite performance, and things like that. So, Bryce, this movie was directed by Neil Jordan. It won the Golden Lion at the Venice International Film Festival in '96, and Liam Neeson won the Best Actor. And then it got a lot of hype because people were thinking, okay, this is going to be like a good Oscar contender. It's only nominated for 2 Oscars, Best Cinematography, Best Score, doesn't win either. In a recent Joe.ie poll from a few years ago, it was voted as the best Irish movie ever made. And I, for one, I think this is a brilliant movie. I love it. I think it's got a great, brilliant cast. In most points, a fine script. And I think the thing that Neil Jordan, who deserves massive credit for this, he's distilled quite complex history into very cinematic scenes that work really well on camera. And then he's intercut them very well, particularly when you've got like the assassinations and the repercussions scene, the assassinations of the Cairo gang members and Michael Collins and Kitty on the bed talking about freedom. Even the ending, which I think the ending is brilliant in this movie, when you've got his assassination interspersed when we hear Sinead O'Connor singing He Moved Through the Fair, interspersed with Kitty putting on her wedding dress, you know? So I think it's brilliantly done. And when I watched this movie growing up, which I did maybe a dozen times, I think maybe like you, possibly, I was a little bit critical because I was thinking, well, you know, it's not, there are some historical problems with it. Some of the script is a little bit kind of cheesy. But actually, I was thinking, you know, when I watched this recently again, this is from the mid-90s, and we were kind of spoiled back then that Hollywood wanted to make these kind of movies. These kind of movies don't really get made anymore. These kind of historical epics about, let's face it, a relatively small country with relatively small population, a fantastic story, but with a big Hollywood budget to back it up. And that kind of really doesn't happen so much anymore. It's more difficult to get funding. Every other movie is a Marvel superhero movie, it seems. So I think for those reasons, Neil Jordan deserves huge credit, and I think the film is wonderful. I really do. What about you?
Yes, I'd agree with you there. Having watched this back, having watched it many, many, many times, it's grown on me. And it's grown on me to the extent that I really would agree with you there. Neil Jordan is a great director. There's a lot of issues I have with this movie, which we'll discuss subsequently. But in the round, it's probably more accurate, in fact, than many films that we've actually discussed on this pod, in terms of, as you quite rightly put there, in terms of distilling an awful lot, and I mean an awful lot of history and an awful lot of issues into something very cinematic. And on watching it umpteen times, I think it gets better with age. And I'd agree with you there. It's grown on me over the years. I've got a major beef with this in terms of its conventional Hollywood simplification of roles. But sure, we'll get to that. I'd agree with you. It gets better with age, like a fine wine.
Yeah, and I also find it, for the last 20 years of my life, I've been, actually almost 30 years now, I've been quoting this movie in day-to-day situations. Every time I hear the word riddling, I instantly think of, go easy on the riddling, will you, lads? and that scene. So I think the first 2/3 of this movie, basically before we get to the truce at about, I think it's about 1.5 hours in, it's just fantastic. I would say if I had criticisms, then the last third kind of slows down, struggles a little bit. Maybe that's the point, because now we're in a divided situation. We've gone through the War of Independence into the Civil War period. Maybe that's kind of the point of the movie, that it kind of, the wheels come off a little bit in terms of its kind of direction, because that's the nature of the history. But then I think it's the third act is rescued by a great ending, which I'll fawn over a bit later. It's worth mentioning as well that the interesting history, how this film got funding. Neil Jordan made The Crying Game and then Interview with the Vampire with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. And those two films were very successful, and he was basically given carte blanche from Warner Brothers to do whatever he wanted. And so he dug out a script he wrote 12 years prior, Michael Collins. This movie was also, Richard Harris wanted to make this movie in the 60s. And Michael Cimino, who was the director of The Deer Hunter, also wanted to make it in the 80s. I also read that Kevin Costner was interested in the 90s. This could have been a Costner full-blown Hollywood production, probably worst for it. And so what do you think? You know, we've talked very often on this podcast about this balance that blockbusters are always trying to straddle between they must have a heroic story, and that must be counterbalanced by like evil characters. So it's kind of a bit black and white. And I think probably, should we get onto the history now? Probably Éamon de Valera, portrayed by the wonderful late Alan Rickman, probably fills those shoes a bit too well, doesn't he? He's a bit too negatively portrayed.
Yes, I think has always been my main gripe with this movie, and like we have to hold our hands up and declare personal interest here. You know, our family. What was Dev? They, you know, in terms of that Civil War division, our family would have been on the Republican side of things. That Civil War division marked Irish politics for the next 100 years, so it is very significant. So we were not on the Collins side on our family, so I'd like to declare that first of all. That notwithstanding, I think it is very much guilty of, well, as any Hollywood movie must, if you're building up someone to be the great hero, then you must have a villain. Now, for me, in this whole story, if we're going to reduce history to black and white, to a morality tale of goodies and baddies, well, from my perspective, sure, Collins is a heroic figure. Who are the baddies then? Well, Britain, the British Crown and Empire. But no, because in this, of course, the baddie has to be Éamon de Valera. Now, I think it's really significant that Rickman plays de Valera as sort of, you know, a villainous, dare I say, a sort of Severus Snape type character.
Yeah. Well, he's done some great villains before, hasn't he? Sheriff of Nottingham.
Yeah, but
Hans Gruber.
We haven't got time to get into really the real nitty gritty of that Collins de Valera fallout over the treaty, which is, I think, portrayed pretty well in the movie. The treaty debates, which you quoted at the start.
Yeah.
You know, De Valera, you know, first inaccuracy, De Valera is not, of course, there outside the GPO. He was a commandant at Boland's Mills, further south in the city.
That's in the opening scene.
That's in the opening scene, of course, where Sackville Street is also inaccurately called O'Connell Street. I could go on, but you know, look, we're not going to get pedantic about this, but I think where it moves beyond more sort of pedantic historian nitpicking is, and what the few scenes where I do find sort of unforgivable is that, you know, De Valera was not snivelling behind a rock like a cowardly, sobbing pederast to Jonathan Rhys-Meyer's assassin when Collins was killed. Far from it. In general, De Valera, of course, he has to be the baddie to Collins's goodie here. That's Hollywood movie making. But, you know, the anti-treatyites, from my perspective, weren't all firebrands. De Valera he shoulders definitely a lot of the blame for the Civil War, but it wasn't all his fault. Collins repudiated an electoral pact that they had. We don't get that here.
What do you mean? Sorry, what do you mean by that? He reneged on something, did he, Collins?
You talked about the last bit of the film, which, you know, everything is the slide into Civil War, and that is portrayed as Dev's intransigence. which is true. But there was a lot of coherence. There's a lot of coherent arguments behind the anti-treatyite perspective on the Civil War, and I'm not just coming at this from a partisan perspective. Not least the issue of taking an oath to the crown. The question remains. What have we been fighting for? Which is the big issue here. Let alone dare we mention the mutilation of the country, which the treaty brings with it. 17% of the national territory having to be lost. Okay, Collins saw that as a stepping stone to freedom. We'd eventually get that back. But, what I'm trying to get at here is that Dev has to be portrayed as the big baddie here. And for some people, he is a big baddie. But I'm here to sort of inform listeners that it wasn't that black and white. That Collins, for all his admirable tendencies, did have, and I would go as far as to say, I'm going to try and qualify my language here, some sort of quasi-proto-fascist tendencies. Dev, in many ways, was the more impressive thinker on the global stage. Certainly the more impressive statesman, the more impressive anti-imperialist and principled Republican than Collins. Collins was a rough man in many ways. That isn't portrayed here. Hollywood, of course, is simplifying this as Collins as the dignified man of peace. Even in the final scene there, they say he tried to remove the gun from Irish politics. He really didn't. Even post treaty, he didn't. So it's a big simplification. I think. Look, my final point here in terms of Dev being the baddie is we can't let this point go. Collins dies at age 31. He's always going to be the lost leader, the great man, right?
Yeah.
De Valera dies aged 92. He stays on too long. He goes on to assume power in Ireland. He stays on too long. And because he stays on too long as Taoiseach and then President of Ireland, there's a generation of Irish people, Neil Jordan being one of them, journalists, filmmakers and historians, largely concentrated around Dublin 4 in the sort of affluent south of Dublin. Yeah. Who coming of age... it's still in De Valera's Ireland. Our own mother would talk about this, which you have a geriatric guy still presiding over a very impoverished country at that time. And so that generation very much views Dev as the enemy, the big baddie, okay? That he was responsible for that Catholic, quasi-authoritarian, stultifying cultural conservatism of Ireland at the time. And to a large extent, yes, he was. But I think historians, and I've got to mention this, have come to perhaps a more mature and nuanced understanding of Dev these days than perhaps this generation, and I group Neil Jordan in this generation's revulsion towards De Valera and simplification of it in terms of Collins baddie, Dev goodie. Now, I know that's a little bit of a rant, but listeners have to be aware that De Valera was not Severus Snape. He was, in many ways, a very impressive anti-imperialist, a dogmatic and intransigent and difficult man, but probably the greatest man of the Irish 20th century in many regards, which of course is not portrayed here in any way, shape or form. He's the baddie.
Well, at one point, I like the script, so it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on it later, but at one point he says, Alan Rickman, "We'll see who's the big fella." Right at the end, I was thinking, oh my God, it really is lathered on thick that this guy's the baddie. Unnecessarily, I think, in many ways. I just want to come back at you, though, to the counterpoint to that is this movie, I think when it works best, it's caught up in that kind of romanticism, that wonderful energy of revolution, fighting against a great power. And could it be then a little bit forgiven for giving a quite romantic portrayal? I mean, aside from the fact you've got to have a goodie and a baddie, is it in the vein of that kind of romantic struggle for independence? It's never as romantic as it is in real life. Could it be forgiven that Michael Collins is portrayed in a more romantic light? I'll give you an example. Twice in this movie, when he's briefing the guys who are going to go out and kill the British agents, he says, I won't force this on any man. Anyone who wants to leave, they can leave, and there's no problem with that. I find those scenes a little bit difficult to believe. If you get to that point within the IRA, you've been handpicked by Michael Collins, it's very unlikely you're going to be walking out the door, isn't it?
I don't have an issue with that. I don't have a problem with that. No? I think, to quote another great contemporary of this era, another great Republican from this era and later statesman in Ireland, Frank Aiken, who famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "A child could see the justice of our cause." And I think the justice of the cause was on the Irish side. And I can get into the history there if you like. So I've no problem personally with the romanticisation of Irish rebels, goodies, British baddies, because, as I said before on this pod, very, very broadly speaking, that is how I would judge the state of affairs to be. What I don't agree with is that, Dev is... in some ways, this film is almost suggesting that Dev and his conniving was worse than the British Empire. And I can't sort of stand by that.
Yeah, I kind of know what you mean. They certainly spend a little bit more time on sort of going into that rather than the British Empire is portrayed as quite effectively by the wonderful Charles Dance, for example, in this movie, who's just like thoroughbred evil. When he goes, does he have a face? There's Collins. It's very clear that's not really explained. Why the British Empire is in a bad situation is not explained to the same extent why De Valera was a baddie. Neil Jordan says that he didn't intend to imply that Éamon de Valera ordered the death of Michael Collins. And there's also some confusion about, basically, when this movie came out, Warner Brothers, the studio, lent on them to make the ending of this movie a little bit more romantic. I've read that Neil Jordan, I don't know whether this is true, Neil Jordan wanted to focus a bit more on the politics. Who knows? He may have been even more anti-Dev, I don't know. But the Warner Brothers wanted to make it a bit more romantic, which would suggest to me that's part of the reason why we have De Valera snivelling behind a haystack or whatever it is, portrayed as a coward at the end. Way over the top. Just as a counterpoint to that, the final quote of this movie from De Valera: "It is my considered opinion that in the fullness of time, history will record the greatness of Michael Collins, and it will be recorded at my expense." Now, I've read, it'd be interesting if you'd know something about this, that's not a real quote, or at least very dodgily conceived. There's a lot of arguments over whether De Valera actually ever said that. And so it kind of, I don't know, weakens Neil Jordan's position. Maybe I'm giving him a bit too much credit. He does, he just does want to paint De Valera as the bad guy.
Yeah, yes, that is a dubious quote. I think, it comes back to this problem of, I can see how you've got a situation there where Neil Jordan, who is a great director, I actually don't think this is his best movie, as an aside. I think The Butcher Boy is Neil Jordan's best movie, alongside a couple of others.
I haven't seen it. You've outsuited me. I haven't seen that one. I've only seen the big ones.
Well, I can understand how he might have been lent on in that regard to villainize De Valera. Sure, we come back to the other issue in terms of, if we talk about villainy. A lot of the British reception of this movie, a lot of British critics. Even very liberal British critics remain sort of uncomfortable with Britain being evil on screen when they feel that that's a simplification. Now, we've talked about the Mel Gibson canon, perhaps. Now, in terms of British villainy, and you mentioned Charles Dance here, I read a review of this by Alex von Tunzelmann in The Guardian. She says that Michael Collins is 30 seconds away from being a great movie, or 30 seconds away from being a movie that has truth and credibility to it, because of the scene in which you have an armoured car firing into the crowd in Croke Park, the Croke Park massacre, which you've already mentioned on Bloody Sunday, the 21st of November 1920. After the assassination of the British spies, the Cairo gang, some of whom, by the way...
Same day, sorry, this is...
Yes, same day. Some, by the way, recent historical scholarship has sort of cast doubt on to what degree they were spies, actually.
Okay.
But her point is that there's an armoured car firing into the crowd. Now, for me, that is an acceptable shorthand. She says that's inaccurate in portraying that massacre. Well, Neil Jordan apparently wanted that scene to last 30 seconds. She says that's inaccurate. Okay, well, there's plenty of other massacres and executions which are way worse, which are carried out by the Black and Tans, which is a British paramilitary force at the time, and by the auxiliaries, which basically state-sponsored terrorism of the time, which this film it can't sort of capture. So, for example, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, the British Crown forces, burnt Cork City to the ground in 1920, right? That's the third biggest city in Ireland. The second biggest in, what is now the Republic of Ireland. So, can I excuse the shorthand of an armoured car firing into the crowd when actually those innocent people and players were executed by shot rather than by machine gun from an armoured car? Absolutely, yes, I can. You see what I mean here?
Yeah.
So I don't understand why some people get... And again, you have to declare personal interest here. Our own grandfather was in that Croke Park massacre. He
was at the game, yeah.
He escaped by climbing over the railway end. He was sporting Tipperary and escaped with his life. So, again, we have to hold our hands up and say we have a sort of vested interest there. But I don't have as much problem, I suppose, with that as I do with the sort of arch villainy of Severus Snape de Valera.
Yeah, well, I think this comes to... Oh, Marie's calling me. Hang on a second. Yeah, I'm in the middle of recording the podcast right now. That's okay. This guy, bye.
Leave that in the podcast.
Leave it in.
Yeah.
Always turn your phones off before recording a podcast. That's what we learned today. This comes to a point, Bryce. I read a quote, and I cannot find it again, but I'm sure I've read it. That this movie is authentic, not accurate, in that it distills a lot of stuff. It has figures that are composites of different, more than one person, notably Ned Broy. But it basically stays true to the historical spirit of the movie. And I think what you mentioned there about the Croke Park massacre is particularly relevant because the complaints I've read is that the armoured cars stayed outside. It was the Black and Tans were shooting their rifles, and it wasn't a machine gun firing into a crowd.
Yeah, but come on. I mean, this is like levels of pedantry, I think, are a bit silly because...
Well, I know, but to be honest, when I saw this film as a child, and then I learned that, okay, I'm going to use this, I'm doing inverted commas here, listeners, only 14 people were killed. This scene does make it look like that you think, my God, it must have killed like 200 people or something. But I don't mind. I'm not making the point that it's wrong. I'm making the point that Neil Jordan would make. He wanted a quick cinematic point. He's making a quick cinematic point. The best way is to get a car rolling onto the turf and shooting people. That works much more cinematically than explaining, the Black and Tans were just there to do search and whatever they call it, go through just trying to find a few people, and it got out of hand. You can't explain that in a movie of this grandeur. You have to simplify it. And I like you, don't have a problem with the same.
I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that, and again, to come back to your first point there, I don't have a problem. You're going to have to, with something this complex, have composite characters. So you mentioned Ned Broy.
Yeah.
Another one is Collins's right-hand man, the mustachios little fella, is basically a composite of a couple of men, Joe O'Reilly and Emmett Dalton. Emmett Dalton, who'd later go on to be a sort of found the Irish kind of movie industry himself. I don't have a problem with that merging of characters, first of all. The second point you make there about the Croke Park massacre, I don't actually think, you've got to consider this was filmed, that scene is obviously not filmed in, the modern day Croke Park is enormous, so they filmed it in Bray Wanderers football ground, which is tiny, the Carlisle ground. So I don't agree with you that it implies there was about 200 people killed. I don't think there's much more of an implication that it was more than about a dozen. Obviously, you have the death of Hogan, for whom the stand is named after these days. I just find that the most sort of pedantic criticism that, that was untrue about that colonial massacre. I find that just really a little pedantic.
There's one or two other things I wanted to quickly mention because I think this film is basically completely justified, let's say, in what it does with the history, apart from the exception of De Valera. In the other stuff, it does a really good job. I mean, for example, you've mentioned De Valera was not at the GPO during the Easter Rising. When Michael Collins was locked in overnight, looking through the files, it was actually at Pearse Street Garda Station, not the castle. I mean, I'm bringing up these points to tell to say it doesn't matter. Ned Broy is a composite of a guy called Dick McKee who was shot and Ned Broy who died in the 70s. So he didn't actually get killed as this film portrays. And you've got things like car bombs, which don't happen till later. But my point is that, as this quote said, it's authentic, not accurate. It's within the spirit of the history. And I don't, with the exception of De Valera, I don't think there's any point at which it crosses the line, personally. I've got one question to ask, though. Which I wondered about, I don't know this. It's implied by the film. Did De Valera set up Michael Collins to fail in the negotiations? Did he send him just because he knew he wouldn't be able to get the whole of Ireland, that it would be partitioned?
De Valera had actually partaken in those negotiations. This is something which the movie doesn't portray himself before the point where Collins was sent over. Look, I'm not going to launch a stout defence of De Valera. He was a very difficult man, and talk about pedantry. He was a mathematician who took pedantry to a ridiculous degree, and was to a huge extent responsible for the stultifying Catholicised conformism and poverty of Ireland right up until the late 50s and 60s. I'm not going to defend De Valera, but in terms of those treaty negotiations, Collins was sent over there with his team with express instructions to report back to Dublin. They failed to do so. There was plenty of evidence that Collins was having a grand old time, by the way, over in London, wined and dined and, having affairs and all the rest. Let's not get into that. It's not really important. But, again, this is highly simplified. Was he set up? Well, they were supposed to report back. Look, De Valera in many ways was a more wily negotiator than Collins. He had more experience. I think Lloyd George famously said that negotiating with De Valera was like trying to pick up mercury with a spoon. He was a tough cookie, right? Now, okay, maybe he was less pragmatic. Yes, probably less pragmatic in some ways, more of an ideologue than Collins. Look, Collins, to be fair, knew the situation which the army was in, by which I mean the IRA. How much longer could they go on? Nobody had a better handling of the war than he did. Not just in that capacity, but in financial capacity. He's basically Minister for Finance, He's running the show there. So I'm not denying that he had the best handle on things, but the story, as always, is a lot less black and white. They should have reported back to Dublin first. They didn't. They went ahead and signed. Under pressure, let's not forget, from Lloyd George and his fellow cabal of British imperialists, that if they didn't sign, that this would bring, quote, immediate and terrible war to Ireland, i.e. Britain would ramp up the already considerable terror to 11. Now, again, that context of bullying them into signing the treaty is never properly discussed here. And in consequence, those treaty debates, they're being asked to ratify something which was basically signed effectively under duress. Right, so I'm sounding Hitler here like I'm giving a completely partisan Republican view, but I think it's a necessary counterweight to the perhaps necessary simplification of Hollywood history here.
It is very interesting that they don't make that point about, as you say, actually, when you mentioned it earlier in the podcast that De Valera is clearly the baddie, not the British Empire, I actually thought, really? And you've actually convinced me. It's a very interesting point that they don't show any of the negotiations in this movie.
No, they don't, and it's probably a bit of an oversight. And of course, the love story. Well, that again, Collins. That's let's not get into that. But it wasn't the Hollywood simplified Julia Roberts. I'm so in love with you. Collins was getting his end away with did women other than Kitty Kiernan, I can tell you, and
hanging out with J.M. Barrie, which I think maybe that's why there's a reference to Peter Pan in this movie, possibly. Or maybe I think that might be an Easter egg. I don't know.
What's the Peter Pan reference?
When he's in when he's meeting Broy in the library, and he says, "Sure, anything's possible if you wish hard enough." And he says, "Do you know who said that?" And Broy says, "You did." And he said, "No, 'twas him. Peter Pan." Nice Liam Neeson impression there, but maybe I thought that was an Easter egg. I've got a statistic about that Peter Pan book that you won't believe later on in this podcast. Anyway,
you're talking about how it's a strong script. I think it is, largely speaking, a strong script, but there are some really poor moments. For example, the well-worn directorial technique of using a steam train to forge forward the motion and the plot of the movie, that scene where Broy and Collins are, and there's something he says, I like steam trains, they remind me of places I'll never go, or something. There's some really corny and weak lines in this movie.
Yeah, I've got a few others written down. I've mentioned the one about De Valera. We'll see who's the big fella. And I've got to say, it doesn't work for me. I know it does for a lot of people, but when they bring Harry Boland out of the was it Canal? He wasn't actually shot. He was shot, wasn't he? In I think leaving Vaughan's hotel or a hotel in Dublin. So that's not technically correct. But he says, "Who closed your eyes?" And then one of the soldiers says, "Oh, he was one of them." And he says, "No, laddie, he was one of us." And I thought, hell, that's rough. I mean, I honestly know that what that scene a lot of people really like that scene, but for me, the script is a bit rough. But as you are a historical script writer, Bryce, what did you make of it? And the other parts of it, there's, for example, the great line about you've kept us waiting 700 years, you can have your 7 minutes. Apparently it was actually 90 minutes late and the ceremony was inside, but that's just not going to work on camera. And he also says, better Belfast efficiency is what they need, blows up.
I've criticised this movie quite a lot, but I have to say, having watched it back and having actually written stuff of this period, I actually, I think we all owe this movie like a big debt of gratitude, because I'll admit I found myself, when I've done stuff of this period and place, actually unconsciously lapsing into writing moments of this film. It's easy to criticise. It does. It's actually a. Despite the corny moments, it does, as you said at the start, it does a very good job of distilling a very complex history into what is a really good cinematic piece. And about the cinematography, I think probably the battle scenes, the start, the GPO, some of the Civil War scenes, they're actually really good as well. I think they stand up, even though it's a fairly old movie at this stage. So look, I've criticised it. Look, my final criticism, if you'll indulge me, is going to be that I think that Julia Roberts is seriously miscast. I think that the most ridiculous scene is it's a very short scene, but after the treaty split, Collins is electioneering, he's at the hustings, suddenly there's a disruption, a commotion, horses are run through the town square.
I know what you're going to say.
And Kitty Kiernan, if we consider for a second, without wanting to labour this point, the position of women in Ireland at this time, Julia Roberts smashes away into the crowd and holds a pistol to the head of an IRA man who's forcibly broken up this rally, which is absolutely ridiculous. But look, I'm going to park my pedantry and my inaccuracies there, because this movie is good. It's a good movie, and as I said before, it's a darn sight more accurate in the round. And authentic. You hit the nail on the head. Authentic than a lot of stuff we've analysed on this pod.
Exactly. Well, one can only wonder if Kevin Costner had got involved, and this was a Kevin Costner vehicle coming off the back of JFK and stuff like that.
Well, Liam Neeson,
as he was in the early 90s. My God, can you imagine?
Look, Julia Roberts miscast. Liam Neeson brilliantly cast, for my money. I know he's a northerner, but he's brilliantly cast.
We'll get on to that in our final section of questions. But I just want to mention a few other things. Firstly, that this was R-rated in the US, 15 in the UK, and a PG in Ireland, which I enjoyed, because it was so historically important that the Film Classification Board encouraged parents and guardians to make up their own minds whether they would allow children to watching people's heads getting blown off and stuff. But maybe there's a serious point to be made there, that this is such a milestone really in Irish cinema, and what that kind of period means in how the Irish nation thinks of itself. Yeah,
and also it's not, to give the film its due, it's not gratuitous in its violence, which so many movies of this ilk, and in general these days are. I sound like a complete prude now. That I don't think, this is an incredibly bloody time, but it is never gratuitous or sort of flippant in its violence, and I think that Neil Jordan's to be commended for that.
We have to talk about, Bryce, when we had this as a DVD. Do you remember this was a flippable DVD?
Yep. Flip over for side 2. Exactly,
which apparently... I'm not sure if this is true. Please, listeners, if you know, let us know, comment section or email us. The flip occurs when he flips sides. Basically, when he's fighting an insurrection against the military, is side one, and side two is as soon as he starts bombing the forecourts with, like British artillery on side two. Don't know whether that's true because I can't find the DVD. But that might be true. I just wanted to mention as well the score. So you mentioned the cinematography. That got a Oscar nomination. The score also got an Oscar nomination. I think rightly so. I think it's a brilliant score. There's, Sinead O'Connor's in there. The background music, the theme is works very well. And the end of this movie, as I've mentioned, I think that it kind of gets a little rickety at the Civil War. It loses focus, let's say. I'm not saying that as a criticism. It's just the nature of the history. But I think it's really rescued by the scene at the end where it's basically we see archive footage of his funeral. And we hear this. I think it's an absolutely wonderful piece of music by Elliot Goldenthal, who wrote the score. It's called Funeral/Coda. We hear this wonderful sort of building but unresolved piece of music. It works fantastically well in cinema terms. And, Bryce, it was rejected by Michael Mann it was originally written as the final bit of music in the movie Heat. When, spoiler alert, when De Niro has just been shot and is dying holding hands with Al Pacino. And what I did was I watched that scene, muted it, and played this bit of music instead of the Moby bit of music that Michael Mann chose. And it does work well, but I think it's a little bit too grand, the piece of music. And in this context of Michael Collins, because then it talks about his legacy, it goes in slightly into the wider political context. It's just an absolutely wonderful ending. I just thought, wow, what a way to end it. That's just such a great way to end a film.
I think you're great. I think
really it gets the goosebumps going.
Especially since her death, poor Sinead O'Connor, that rendition of She Moved Through the Fair, arranged, as you said, a really good arrangement by Elliot Goldenthal. You're right, it's a really good score. I'm just going to sort of demean our honest appreciation of the score by going back to that scene of Belle and the Blah, the assassination, the old joke being that Collins, who'd been heavily drinking before he was assassinated, again, not really conveyed in the movie. He was a half shot when he arrived in Belle and the Blah, and he left fully shot. But I think you're right, Elliot Goldenthal, a great score, a great ending there. Agree 100%. I do, though, want to preempt Sood's Corner. I'm going to quote, sorry to preempt this, I know it's not good to do that, but Donald Clark, who's a really good film critic of the Irish Times, actually, and whom I respect tremendously, in Sood's Corner, he says that Elliot Goldenthal's score surges like a Celtic marler, which I think is laying it on a little thick, but I think it is a real shame that he didn't get an Oscar because, again, watching this back, it's very good, isn't it? The score is very, very good.
Fabulous, yeah. And actually, this might sound a bit odd, but I think the most memorable shot for me in this movie is when Collins gets killed at the end, and I was watching it over and over, the shot. I can't work out how they did it. It's done so well. It's over the shoulder of the assassin, and as soon as he pulls the trigger, Liam Neeson hits the floor. But it's done from a wide angle, because as far as I read the history, I think one of his seconds in command, once they were getting ambushed, and it was only by like 5 IRA guys, they said, "Oh, let's just drive through," and Collins said, "No, let's stay and fight." And Collins, he's the only one that was shot during the ambush. He's the only one that was injured or killed, and it's so sort of. I don't know whether it makes his death more tragic that it was, really it's completely avoidable. But the way that it's shot, I think, again, talking about authentic, I think it really does that justice. Usually you'd get like a mid shot or a close up of someone getting hit and then, blah, blah, blah. But the way that they shoot it, that long shot, and he goes down as soon as the it's kind of like completely like, you're not even paying attention to it. Oh, he's been killed. And that's it. And then you get Ian Hart, who's sort of, crying over his body. But it's brilliantly done. So I'm preempting our questions, Bryce, basically. Mm-hmm. And I'm preempting best scene. But we'll come on to that in a second. So the first question is your favourite character or performance. It's quite a lot to get through here.
Let me chew over this and think about this. Who is yours?
Well, I always go through the list. Julia Roberts, interesting you talk. Julia Roberts just gives a standard mid-90s Julia Roberts, attractive woman. She's not really doing anything, is she, in this movie? Apparently, she rang Neil Jordan and said, "I'm interested." Someone called Mary Louise Parker, I'm afraid I don't know who that is, was already cast. And apparently Julia Roberts rang up and said, "I'm interested." And that's basically, in the mid-90s, you can't turn that down. I think Charles Dancer's great as ever. Brendan Gleeson, I've forgotten he was in this movie. And did you notice that not only Gerard McSorley, who plays Cal Brewer, who plays Todd Unctious in Father Ted, for fans of Father Ted, but the man who plays Father Cyril Macduff is also in this movie.
Yes.
Don Wycherley appears right at the end.
Yeah.
Father Cyril Macduff. I didn't realise that until I was a bit older.
I actually think the best performance for me is Stephen Ray. Stephen Ray plays Ned Bry. I think it's a really good, fairly understated, very good civil servant portrayal. I think he's a great actor, Stephen Ray. I've seen a lot of his stuff on stage as well as screen. I really rate him. And talk about method acting, because Ray was, of course, famously married for 20 years to Dolores Price, one of the most notorious IRA activists of the modern Troubles. Now deceased, actually. But Stephen Ray, I think for me is the stand-up performance here.
Well, I was going to say Liam Neeson, actually. That gets my performance, because I think he does a wonderful... despite the fact he was 43 when he played the part, he looks a little bit old for Michael Collins, who died when he was 31. He gives this wonderful physical performance, wonderfully measured performance between this physical performance, the big fella. He's sort of kind of, I mean this in a positive way, lumbering across the screen in a lot of scenes. And he's got this just absolutely magnetic charm and charisma. But I think you're right, actually, about Stephen Ray. He does this very subtle... very centered performance as a man under an extreme amount of pressure, and it's done with aplomb. Very good. What was your favourite scene? There's a few good ones. I think this film is full of really good cinematic scenes. There's a few to choose from. It's
the portrayal of Bloody Sunday, as we mentioned, in November 1920. The assassinations caught back to Collins in the hotel room with Kitty Kiernan. Again, some really poor lines. "You've sent out your boys, haven't you, Mick?" or something stupid like that. But then the leading up to the Croke Park massacre, I really enjoyed that sequence. Although I do agree with you that the ending is superb when they're running down from the hills towards the convoy.
Yeah, that's such a great shot.
Haunting, really.
Yeah, it is. There is some. I don't understand quite what it is, but there's some haunting aspect to the ending which makes you feel the unhealed trauma and the shock of Collins being assassinated. I can't quite work out what that is. Some of my favourite scenes, I love the bit where Broy gets caught and he goes, "I know exactly where I'm going." I think that's a brilliant scene. And then the other scenes would be when they're mixing assassination shots, basically. People getting assassinated mixed in with other bits, and there's this ramping up of tension. We talked about the Battle of Algiers. We're actually recording this afterwards, so that if you're looking for that episode, it's not out yet, guys, listeners. But in a similar kind of way, it ramps up this tension of this guerrilla warfare very well. I also love the scene right at the beginning where they raid the police station. And you get this great bit of movement, this flaming bit of turf, and he goes, "I'll make a army out of ye if it's the last thing I do." Brilliant scene. Love that scene. I'm going to go with the ending. I think the ending scene at the end, I think, is my favourite and best done. I have to ask you the question, Bryce. Which part should Mel Gibson have played?
Mel Gibson, I think, would be incapable of playing anything but the titular role, surely. But yes. But thank goodness.
Can you believe? Could you believe the inaccuracies? If he had made this film, he'd probably end up sleeping with the Queen or something. I don't know. But it's on a serious point. We're talking about the balance between Hollywood and history. If this was made in the vein of something like Braveheart, can you Again, I'm just having a thought of Gibson as Collins. Who should do the DVD commentary? I've got, and I think you'll probably agree, Éamon de Valera.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to get the Republican side on this, especially when we come to the Civil War. You can't reduce the whole Republican perspective, I don't think, to firebrands like Cathal Brugha. There was a lot more consistency in thought there. So yeah, I'd agree with you on that one.
And what is the best companion film? If you had to watch this movie on as a Saturday matinee, as they used to do in cinemas, which two films would you watch together? This and...
Well, I think absolutely. Look, you started this pod with the quote from the debates in Dáil Éireann, the man who won the war. Again, we're back to great man history here, aren't we? Who really won the war? Well, yes, Collins was a brilliant manager of the war, as it were. But the men who won the war were largely the fairly anonymous, non-inheriting sons of the farm, up the mountains, in the hills, waging a guerrilla war, and their urban counterparts. And for that perspective, along with the much-needed Republican counterweight to the Collins meta-narrative, you have to watch The Wind That Shakes the Barley by Ken Loach, which goes a little bit too far in trying very hard to inject class politics into the Irish Civil War, but nonetheless is the good bottom-up provincial, non-metropolitan, we're not in the streets of Dublin, we're down in Cork, Republican view of the conflict and then the subsequent civil conflict, brilliantly led by Cillian Murphy in that movie. And of course, in that type of movie, you get many more of the actual dynamics of that war in terms of the poverty, the role of trade unions, for example, in advancing the independence cause, which you're never going to get in a boiled down, simplified Hollywood great man version of that war, which we have in Michael Collins. So it has to be, as a companion piece, it has to be The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which I believe won the Palme d'Or. It's a great film in its own right.
It did, yeah.
It's a very different movie, and for my money, actually a better movie than this. I'll go as far as to say that.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in a very long time, but I always remember it being a better movie than this. I mean, it's just the perfect counterbalance. I suppose we're blessed we've got both, and did win the Palme d'Or in 2006. I saw Ken Loach at a Bath FC game about 10 years ago. I think you met him, didn't you? Did you meet him?
I actually met him. Well, I don't want to sound sort of gossipy here, but I did meet him. It was the launch of a different movie.
Well, where did you meet him? I'm dreading to
at
hear.
the launch of a different movie he was doing a movie about Britain, a sort of documentary piece about the British welfare state. And I spoke to him at the start, and I said, thank you so much for The Wind That Shakes the Barley, because we badly needed the Republican perspective on this conflict in the wake of Michael Collins. And he didn't really know what I was talking about, to be honest. He quite, in keeping with the dignity of the man, he basically said, look, that was all to do with my writer, really,
Okay.
I can't claim credit for that.
Yeah.
He didn't really... I think Loach was interested in that project in the sense that, he did a movie, but it's a very right-on kind of... It's the more lefty perspective on this whole thing, in keeping with the stuff he's done on the Spanish Civil War. I don't think he... I think by his own admission, kind of properly understood the real dynamics there, or why I was quite so grateful to him. But there we go.
Probably, maybe the best companion movie in terms of historical balance ever that we've had in this podcast, these two movies together, Michael Collins and The Wind That Shakes the Barley. There's also, Brendan Gleeson played Michael Collins in a TV version called The Treaty in 1991, which is about the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Apparently, I haven't seen it. It's a lot of old men discussing in courtrooms the treaty. Engrossing, though, I've heard. What's going in our Hall of Fame, Bryce? This is items we want to put, either props or historical objects we want to put in our museum of historical movies.
There's so many to choose from here, but perhaps it would be Julia Roberts' little pistol, which she draws hilariously on a hardened IRA man in a town square.
Yeah.
I mean, what
does she say? I've forgotten what she says. She says a line like "drop it" or something.
And Collins and Liam Neeson is yelling at her, get out of there, Kitty, get out of there.
I want the and now what? Do I get to wear that hat? That's what I want. I want that fluffy, the hat with feathers on it. Yeah. What would happen in the sequel if there was one? I think, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, I suppose, does a job of focusing more on the Irish Civil War. Of course, in Michael Collins, we don't really get we don't get any kind of resolution, do we, to the Civil War? What actually happened there, Bryce?
Well, how can I condense this? Well,
in 30 seconds,
Collins's side wins essentially. De Valera loses as they'd lost the vote narrowly, albeit narrowly, in Dáil Éireann. They lose that civil war. A very bloody little civil war, and the treaty essentially. There've been big hopes in terms of the treaty that Collins had placed a lot on something called the Boundary Commission, which would revise the border in Northern Ireland. That didn't happen. Partition was sort of copper fastened thereafter. Although the Irish Civil War wasn't really about partition, it was more to do with people not wanting to swear an oath of allegiance to the crown, which is of course later removed when De Valera, to give him his due, comes back and effectively achieves the Republic in all but name by using the abdication crisis in the late 30s to actually remove the British Crown from Irish affairs. But that's another story, as is the fact that Collins's party later goes on to become the fascist movement in Ireland for a short time, or align with the Blue Shirt movement, which again tells you perhaps a little bit about some tendencies, without wanting to be anachronistic or too hindsighty, of Collins, which maybe are not explored in this movie.
Okay, I've got a good one for Pedant's Corner, as promised. Here we go. From the moviemistakes.com. Factual error. Collins recites a quote, and his friend asks, who said that? Collins says, him, Peter Pan, and closes the book. The him was obviously referencing the character in the present book, a very thick hardback. However, both Peter Pan and Wendy and Peter Pan are very thin. This almost certainly would not have been a collection of works either, considering how recently Peter Pan would have come out relative to the movie's period. Therefore, the Peter Pan book prop is simply too thick.
Well, do you know what? That's such a good... I'm going to give this movie 0 out of 10 now, because that is quite the revelation.
It's so badly written, I had problems reading it. I would retrospectively put the Peter Pan book prop into our Hall of Fame as well. I've given this a 9, Bryce. I've gone that high just because I think it... actually, I started at the top of the podcast saying, is this the greatest meshing of balance between Hollywood, cinema and history ever? And I think with your deconstruction of De Valera, I'm now backing away from that a little bit. But in spite of that, still a wonderful film, as we've talked about. And I'd give it a 9 out of 10. What about you?
Well, actually, before I give my mark, I've got to just out-pedant the pedant you just read out, because actually Collins' favourite author, so I have read, of sort of popular English Edwardian fiction of that sort of genre, would have been G.K. Chesterton. So I'm not J.M. Barrie. So I'm going to out-pedant the pedants there, first of all. In terms of what I would give this movie overall... I think, like I say, like a fine wine, much better with age, and relative to what a lot of things we've looked at on this pod, you're right when you say the authenticity, despite some huge liberties, is there. It's a really good piece of work, and in the round, and for that reason, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
Brilliant. Okay, super. So that's what's that? A 17 out of 20. That's pretty good going. So thank you very much for listening. That's the end of this episode. Bryce, thank you. And we'll see you next time on the Historical Movies Podcast. That's it for this episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. Don't forget to leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. Spotify and Apple Podcasts make a huge difference to the algorithm. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to leave a comment or a like or subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.